The title of my talk for tonight is Advising Ethics, Considering the Role of National Bioethics Advisory Committees. Before I dive in, I just want to give a little bit of background as to why this topic and why now. This topic is something I started reading about, digging into when I was a student, and was really interested in this idea of at a national level making decisions and offering guidance for these really challenging bioethical questions that we're facing our country. It makes sense that this caught my attention. As Professor Sleesman mentioned, my background's not only in bioethics, but in law. I have an interest in public policy. And so these commissions really just kind of offered an intersection, a point where I could think about law, think about US history, think about bioethics issues, think about public policy, and think about how we live together in society when we don't always agree. And these are things that just I find very important. And so being able to think about it in the context of this framework is something that I've continued to do. And I'm excited to be able to share some of that with you tonight. I've decided to focus on this specifically today, though, because it seems particularly timely to revisit as we're at the beginning of a new presidential administration. And we're coming out of a season where we haven't had a bioethics advisory commission in place from the last administration. So it'll be really interesting to see moving forward if we get another commission and what that looks like. And we're going to talk about that a little bit today. So decision making in bioethics can be a challenging endeavor, regardless of one's background, moral foundations, or personal beliefs. Decision making in the public square, where differing and often opposing viewpoints meet, and yet must still determine a way forward, is even more challenging. So, amidst the current environment we find ourselves in, of a particularly polarizing and contentious political atmosphere, we simultaneously are finding ourselves facing some really just enormous ethical issues. As a world, we're navigating ethical issues and challenges that are raised by a pandemic for which we just didn't find ourselves prepared. And I would argue some of these issues we're facing, at least in the breadth of the pandemic, the issues faced are probably some of the biggest bioethical challenges of our lifetimes. And so we're having to think about these really hard issues. We're also, as a nation, facing these intersection of public health and systemic discrimination, recognizing the impact on health care and health outcomes, particularly for persons of color. And these challenges, they're complicated. They're not theoretical, they're realized, impacting each of us and our neighbors in various ways. So, in light of the circumstances in which we find ourselves currently living, I find myself asking often daily, where do we go from here? Not just as individuals, but as communities, as a nation, as people who live in this world. What at a national level can or should be done to move forward? So, although the circumstances we face today are unique in many ways, this isn't the first time we've had to navigate challenging ethical issues as a larger community. And so in today's talk, I wanted to take a look back the history and the role of bioethics advisory commissions in the United States, really presenting a case for the establishment of a new commission to help us as we move forward as a nation. So today's talk is really going to be divided into three main sections. First, I'm going to present just a brief history of the origins and role of bioethics advisory commissions. Second, I'm going to introduce the subsequent commissions, focusing on the two most recent bioethics commissions, particularly just for a comparative approach. And then finally, I'd like to present some thoughts on the establishment of a new bioethics commission for the current era and share some proposals that have been made about what a commission should look like moving forward and some of my own thoughts on that as well. But I also would like to get you involved in this conversation. I think we really can benefit from learning from one another. So I want to create the space for that in tonight's presentation. So there'll be a couple of points just to give you a heads up throughout the presentation where I may ask for you to chime in. And because this is webinar style via Zoom, it's not going to look like a normal classroom way of doing so. So I'm just going to ask you at those times to use the Q&A feature on your screen. So you can just type in a response there. You can also use the Q&A feature, and I encourage you to do so, to ask questions throughout the presentation. And I will make sure I save time to address as many of those as I can. Okay, so to begin, I think it's a good place to start is the origins. So let's start by looking at how this first National Bioethics Commission was established. The first National Advisory Commission in Bioethics was established as part of the National Research Act of 1974. This act came to be as the result of a series of congressional hearings led by Senator Walter Mondale and Senator Ted Kennedy. The Mondale hearings began actually in 1968 with Senator Mondale proposing a federal commission to look into ethical issues raised by genetic engineering and heart transplantation specifically. So if you think back to the time where this was 1968, the first heart transplant, all of these things, these technologies that I think have become, I mean, they're still not common, but much more commonplace and certainly not shocking for us to hear about in modern times. These were at the origins. And so you have questions raised with genetic engineering, with organ transplantation, and there was concern raised. And Senator Mondale wanted to bring that to the federal level and propose a group that would help spearhead thinking ethically about this as a nation. So how we should think about this collectively. So these hearings, starting in 1968, were met with mixed enthusiasm. So there were many physician scientists opposing the regulations or involvement of individuals outside of the profession. So the idea that they didn't want people from the outside telling them how to be scientists, how to do their medical research. They saw this as potentially impeding progress and discoveries that could help people. On the other side, though, so it wasn't all mixed with opposition. On the other side, we also had support presented by many, including a group of theologians who appeared as witnesses. I believe there was 11 theologian witnesses. And I want to share a quote from one of them that I found compelling. So Reverend Kenneth Fox stated, and I quote, "As theologians, we have one thing to say to the decision-making persons of our society. It is simply a human plea that we get our priorities straight. If we achieve physical authority in the world by means of military power and technical master of environment by our scientific ingenuity, what good is it if human values and even man himself are eradicated in the process? In ancient and more profound words, what will it profit us if we gain the whole world and forfeit our soul?" End quote. It also makes me think of the C.S. Lewis Space Trilogy, for any of you who have read that. If not, just a plug, it's really, really good series. But where this idea of what does it mean to master ourselves? And in doing so, and seeking to master the body, what does it really mean if we give up our souls in doing so? It gets to the heart of this question of what does it mean to be human? So despite this, what I found to be rather compelling testimony, amongst others, concern about the potential of interfering with scientific progress weighed really heavily in tension with the concern of the ethical issues that were raised by many of these new scientific practices. And the 1968 hearings did not result in an advisory board on ethics coming to fruition at that time. Senator Mondale, however, continued to raise the call for an establishment of an advisory commission on bioethical issues. And in 1973, his resolution passed the Senate. Also in 1973, Senator Ted Kennedy presided over hearings on the issues raised in response to concerns of information of research abuses that led to the drafting of the National Research Act taking place. So these hearings addressed numerous issues related to research ethics, particularly, including genetic research and manipulation, prisoner experiments, and regarding the ethical travesties manifested in the Tuskegee syphilis study. So the Tuskegee syphilis study had come to light um, not, not too much earlier, and people, once they realized what was going on there, were pretty outraged. And so this is all going on in the background when these hearings were taking place. Um, Also raised issues of concern at this point were the use of fetuses or preborn babies that were intended to be aborted, being used for research. Uh, so this was all going on. And also, I mean, taking into the broader historical context here, notice the time in which these trials were taking place, right? 1973. So this is the same year that the case of Roe versus Wade was decided at the Supreme Court, uh, declaring abortion as a constitutional right. So you have all this going on in the backdrop. This is a time ripe for bioethical discussion, and these serious ethical challenges were being raised, and people had questions and concerns, and many people were outraged about what they were hearing was going on, and um, decided that something needed to happen. We couldn't just be complacent amidst all that we had learned. So this is, a pretty contentious era. And I will say the fetal research was not actually part of the Kennedy hearing, so it was focused on the other areas I mentioned above. Catholic high school students learned about the fetal research experiments that were taking place, and they engaged. They became advocates for something being done to stop this. So you really see the impact of some grassroots advocacy happening here as well. Um, so this was all going on. Senator Kennedy went on to offer what became known as the Kennedy solution to ensure the passage of the bill that would lead to the National Research Act and establish a National Bioethics Advisory Commission. And the Kennedy solution, part of what it did was it offered to include in the passage of the bill, in the agenda for what the advisory commission would address. It included having the committee address fetal research as one of their first issues, with giving them a 4-month time frame to address that, due to what was considered the urgency of the issue at that time. So in his book, The Birth of Bioethics, Howard Johnson's reflects on the beginning of this first Bioethics Advisory Commission, of which he was a part. And he says he sees Tuskegee as prompting the creation of the commission, with the issue of fetal research acting as a stimulus. He says together they led to bipartisan support of the passage of the legislation that created the first National Bioethics Advisory Commission in the United States. Together, these questions of human subjects research led Kennedy's legislation being passed and then signed into law is the National Research Act in 1974, which subsequently created the first National Bioethics Advisory Commission, which was officially titled, and I'm going to read this because it is long, the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research. So we're just going to refer them as the first National Bioethics Commission for shorthand. This first commission was tasked with an agenda focused on human subjects research, an area where the federal government had control, and recommendations from the commission could then potentially guide regulations, and this was the intent. So the first commission met monthly for its duration through 1978. So I believe they met 2 days a month for those 4 years. Um, except for their first issue, they actually met more. We'll get into that just a little bit. Their mandated assignments were focused. They were all focused on human subjects research, but it was rather ambitious agenda. They were tasked with looking at issues in human subjects research, now what we would identify broadly as vulnerable populations in research. So children, prisoners, persons who are mentally ill and are institutionalized. These were all groups they were specifically tasked with addressing concerns about potential ethical issues and involving them in research. The commission was also tasked, and I quote, to identify the basic ethical principles that should underlie the conduct of biomedical and behavioral research involving human subjects and develop guidelines that should be followed in such research. So that's a pretty big task which they were given to undertake. So although this commission is uh, primarily known for its seminal work with the Belmont Report, I want to discuss its first report. This is one that doesn't get quite as much attention um, in the modern era, but I think is a really important one to talk about and is very relevant to some of that history, brief history that I gave you leading to the commission's creation. Excuse me. So once this commission was established, they really dove right in to what was one of the biggest ethical issues of the day: fetal research. Again, according to Albert Johnson's book, The Birth of Bioethics, the commission met 7 times over those 4 months, which they were tasked with addressing this issue of fetal research. They conducted extensive research into the issue. They did a surveys. They invited philosophers and theologians, including Paul Ramsey, amongst others, to prepare essays for the commissioners to engage with on the ethical aspects of the issue. They invited the public to participate through a public hearing with presentations by, I believe it was 25 interested parties, um, who would have had some sort of interest or connection to fetal research, whether it be connections in that they were researchers involved or those opposed to it, but everyone who had some sort of interest in it. They worked with the commission staff on the report draft, were actively involved in drafting themselves, and ultimately delivered their recommendations to Congress by their 4-month deadline. That's a lot to do in that short window of time. And with the drafting of this first report, it really was a pretty monumental task. And not only did they come up with recommendations, but they modeled a way in which bioethics could be engaged with at a national level, or what Albert Johnson described as a new way of doing ethics. Experts and laypersons, scientists and philosophers, lawyers and theologians all came together with a common goal of helping to provide guidance for the best path forward as a nation while navigating these really challenging ethical issues. So I think that the takeaway, even though we might not remember all the recommendations of all the reports, most of you could probably name what came from the Belmont report, but there was a lot of other reports that came out of that first commission and subsequent ones. Even though we might not know all the conclusions or recommendations, I think really one of the big takeaways we see is this modeling of how to do ethics, the particular way of doing ethics in the public square at such a large scale, so at a national level. And I think there's a lot we can learn from that, and we have learned from that, and can continue to develop and grow from that. So since that first National Advisory Commission on Bioethics, the role of national commissions has shifted some, but remained largely the same in many ways. after the first two commissions, the subsequent commissions were established by the executive branch as presidential commissions. Excuse me. So the first two advisory commissions were both established through legislation, um, although the second commission was based on presidential appointments, with uh, the chair of the committee being confirmed by the Senate. So similar to other types of government advisory roles in some ways. Um, but after that, the commissions were beginning in, I believe it started in the mid 1990s, in the 90s. The commissions were all established through executive order, from the executive branch, from the president. And with the executive orders establishing these commissions, each was charged with a particular purpose. So some of these commissions were given a very narrow focus, very tailored purpose or issue of which they were to analyze and give ethical recommendations, while others were tasked with much broader parameters of the ethical issues they could consider. Each of these respective commissions, though, was created with the intention of guiding the nation's leadership in issues of bioethical importance. We've seen the impact reflected in public policy at times. We've seen it reflected in education, and we've seen it reflected in public engagement and others. So the role of these, although maybe looking different in some ways, has really been vastly influential in our country, even in ways that maybe we don't necessarily recognize or know is from the commissions, like the Belmont Report, for example. I will go back to that example. Many know the Belmont Report. They could tell you the principles that are listed in it who have no idea where the Belmont Report actually came from. It's something that's become so commonly used. In research ethics, so much richness to be gained and so much to be learned. So much richness to be gained and so much to be learned as we are continuing to engage in public bioethics. Seems I'm having a technical issue here, so please forgive me for that. I'm sorry. I hope you all didn't miss too much. But if something doesn't make sense because I glitched, please bring it up in the questions, or if something was incomplete, because I'm not quite sure where the glitch happened. So I apologize for that. Okay. So moving on, I want to just briefly go and introduce you to the subsequent bioethics commissions that have been in place since that establishment of the first commission in 1974. Feel free to ask more questions if you have them. I'd be happy to come back and talk about each of these commissions more specifically at our Q&A time. So if you have questions you think of as I'm introducing them, just go ahead and add them to the Q&A feature, and we will come back to those together. But I want to just briefly introduce you to some of these commissions. You get a little bit of a feel for how they've shaped and changed, or maybe stayed the same since that initial commission was established. So the second commission was the Presidential Commission for the Study of Ethical Problems in Medicine and Biomedical and Behavioral Research. Again, another very long title. Is most notably remembered for its contribution of its report on defining death and its influence on the Uniform Determination of Death Act, which many people are familiar with. That was subsequently adopted in states across the U.S. So this presidential commission had a few members that actually overlapped from the original commission to the second commission. So the idea was that it would be a second commission would be established with some overlap from the first bioethics commission, so to create some continuity across them. This hasn't really been a common practice across the others, so it's kind of interesting to see the transition there. The second commission also had quite a few more members than other commissions did. I think it's just worth noting. It's interesting because this was a commission that was established through legislation. So it's not one that was established through an executive order. And when the administration changed over to the Reagan administration, some of the commissioners whose terms expired, there were new commissioners then appointed by this new administration. So you have more of a revolving door on this commission than you did with others. And it's really interesting when you look at some of the work they put out. So you have different viewpoints represented. In some ways, you have some really cohesive pieces that were very influential in public policy later on, and others, such as their report on access to health care, that ended up being really highly critiqued as not saying much, not offering much. So I think that's partially just the result of the revolving of members. So I just thought that was an interesting side note. Under President Clinton's administration, we saw two commissions. So there wasn't one under President Bush Sr. But under President Clinton's administration, there was one issue-specific commission with the Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments, and then the more broadly focused National Bioethics Advisory Committee, which was in place from 1996 until 2001. They addressed issues, a broader selection of issues, including things like human cloning and stem cell research. The next commission was in place from 2001 to 2009. That was the commission established by President George W. Bush. His commission was led by Dr. Cass and Dr. Pellegrino, both. And this council, similarly to the one before, it also addressed issues of human cloning. It addressed issues of stem cell research, amongst many other things. It also did a white paper on death and dying and aging. So they addressed quite a broad spectrum of issues as well. The most recent bioethics commission was that established by President Obama, and this was the Commission for the Study of Bioethical Issues. And they drafted a series of reports, including one on the ethics of Ebola and public health planning and response, which just feels particularly pertinent to mention in light of the current public health crisis we're facing with the COVID-19 pandemic. In fact, I have it here on my shelf, so you can see what these reports look like. Should have got it down beforehand, but they range. But here's a copy of that one. I have a few of the reports from different commissions on hand here in my home office. And it's really interesting just to pull out and see, okay, thinking about a public health response to a very contagious disease, how they approached that, especially as we're thinking about today's context. And I think it's, also interesting how would the commissions, even though everything they address definitely has an impact on the public at large, there's not quite as many public health specific issues related. So I think this just serves as a kind of unique and interesting example. When looking at these commissions, though, collectively, so from the start in 1974 to the most recent commission, there's a few things that just kind of jump out at me, observations. And this is something, I have a couple questions, so I'm just giving you a warning that I'm going to ask for you to think about and give some feedback on potentially as well. So some of the things that stand out to me. First is, all the commissions discuss or deal with issues of research involving human subjects. So there is not one commission in that whole series from 1974 to the mid 2010s uh, where research involving human subjects hasn't been addressed in some way, shape, or form. So I think that's a really interesting observation. So that's kind of a continuous thread we see throughout them all. Another theme I noticed is that issues of access to healthcare have largely been avoided in these commissions. And so I think part of that is there have been some attempts to address it. I mentioned that with the second commission, but that wasn't deemed to be particularly successful. There also was attempts to address this under the council under President George W. Bush, but that report was never actually completed and published. So I don't know what it said or would have said, I guess. But I did a few years ago, I was at a conference and had the opportunity to hear one of the commission members from that particular council speak about her experience. And the question about that report came up, and all she said was she wished it would have gotten completed because it was really good. So there was, there's been interest there, and there's been questions about if it should be brought to these commissions as something they should address. But really, it's not been successfully done at this point. And so I think that's a particularly interesting of note. It's an issue that's been in public conversation really since the early 1900s. In the United States, and it's something that we just have not really come to a cohesive approach on. So I think that's just an interesting observation as well, and a point where I would be curious to see how a modern commission would address that. Another observation is that innovations and emerging technologies were often addressed by the commission. So the emerging technologies obviously change over time and what those look like. But things like human cloning, stem cell research, genome sequencing, these are all issues that have been addressed by at least one of the commissions, some of them by more. And there's other emerging issues that were addressed by the commissions as they arose as well. So this kind of engagement with a selection of emerging or technologies. Okay, so I promised some questions. Something I would be interested to hear your all's feedback on, and I'll go through a series of these, and if you want to respond, I invite you to do so. Even if you don't, take some time to think about them. I think they're questions worth pondering. The first question is, why do you think human subjects research has been continually addressed by each commission? So I mentioned the first commission was established explicitly to deal with ethical issues surrounding human subjects research in 1974. So we've continued for many, many years to keep addressing these issues. So why do you think this is an issue that keeps coming up? That's my first question. So think about it. If you want to respond, you're invited to do so. The other question is a bit broader in nature that I have, but it's a question of whether or not you think advisory commissions are the best way to address the ethics of emerging technologies. Are they fast enough? Are they responsive enough? Is there another way you think would be better? This is one that I think ties into how we think about approaching innovative and emerging issues often, but I want to tie it specifically to the commissions and their role, and whether or not you think that that's a good fit, and why or why not. So I invite you thinking about these questions. If you want to discuss them more, participate in the chat. I would love to have you do so, but we'll spend some time and probably come back and visit them again at the end. So a Across the years, beginning in 1974, as I mentioned, and continuing through the most recent commission under President Obama, these national advisory commissions have offered guidance on challenging ethical issues facing the nation. They've also grappled with responses to past unethical practices done by our country. So they've, that's what stemmed some of their inception. And when other research abuses have come to light, the commissions have often taken time to specifically address these past problems. These commissions have offered recommendations on emerging issues in bioethics facing our country, and each has contributed to the education of leadership and the nation on bioethical issues. Some of the commissions have been deemed very successful, some less so. Others have been considered controversial, either in their makeup, composition, or their reports. Some less so. Each, though, I would argue, has been impactful in various ways in shaping bioethics at a national level. Okay, so I want to just take a closer look at two of these commissions, just as a quick comparison. I think it helps to look at them side by side. So on the most recent commissions, there's been really what I would see as a focus on education as a way of public engagement and part of the role of the bioethics commissions, though different approaches to this can be seen. So this is why I think it's fun to compare to. So let's compare the two most recent bioethics commissions, those under President Bush and President Obama. I would argue that both of these commissions was particularly successful in their endeavors to create educational material to engage more broadly with trying to get individuals across the nation engaged in issues of bioethics, or at least tools to do so if they wish to. These two commissions looked pretty different. President Obama's commission focused on public engagement through the approach of deliberative democracy. President Bush's council focused a lot really in their writings on addressing the nuances and complexity of the issues they were discussing, and on foundational ethical questions. So such as, what do we mean when we refer to human dignity? This was a question they addressed and actually put together a whole anthology addressing this question of dignity and what human dignity means, recognizing that one's background, where you're coming from, we might all be using this term, but we might not be agreeing on the definitions. They wrote and commissioned essays and put together this whole textbook size book addressing the question of human dignity specifically. It's a really interesting collection that I think would probably interest many of you. So you can still get it online if you're interested. So we see these different approaches these commissions took really highlighted in their respective reports. President Bush's council, I mentioned the one anthology, but they also created an anthology educational material. They, in addition to their white papers and reports they wrote, their reports often included dissenting opinions and very philosophical writing within the actual reports. And President Obama's commission's reports, they look different. I held up one for you to see. They're much more policy style writing, very focused with directed recommendation sections included. Each commission was committed to the idea of furthering public engagement and education in bioethical issues and thinking, really wanting people to think deeply about these issues, or at least carefully about them. From President Obama's commission's focus on public education, it was more broad, where they really focused on creating educational tools. So they created curriculum templates for integrating ethics deliberation into the high school classroom setting. discussion guides for professional use and podcast series. The President Bush's council, as mentioned above, they put together these these anthologies that were wonderful for teaching tools. I have one of those here as well. You guys get my object lesson. I guess that's the benefit of working from my home desk. So this is an example. This is called Being Human. It's a collection of readings that are organized in 10 chapters, essentially, that focus on contributing, and this is the purpose stated at the beginning of the book, to contributing to a richer understanding and deeper appreciation of our humanity necessary for facing the challenges confronting us in a biotechnological age. And to do so, they bring together pieces of classic literature, poetry, essays about nature. It's just really a lovely collection. It's in a wonderful way to engage with some of these deeper questions about what it means to be human. It's not focused on specific bioethical issues as we often think about them, but it's so informative for how we actually engage and think about ethics. So both these commissions were very involved in engaging and educating, providing tools for engaging bioethics as a community. But what those tools look like, how they approached it, were quite different. So I think that's just a good comparison to get a feel of the role and the expansive breadth of what these commissions offered, particularly looking through that lens. So I want to think about kind of moving on to the last section. I'm going to think about envisioning a commission for our current era. So the examples I gave of the previous commissions, those certainly are not all inclusive. They do provide a look at the history and the role of bioethics advisory commissions in the past. And as I think about these commissions and the work they've done, their successes and their shortcomings, I think about how a commission for 2021 in the future should look. We're living in a time of political strife and facing challenging bioethical issues at the same time. We're living with deep divisions and we seek healing in a way forward. So how, as a nation, should we approach these challenging issues in bioethics? I want to introduce a couple of potential approaches that have been proposed. I'd love for you guys to think about if any of these resonate with you, or if there's other approaches that you think would be good ways to engage as well. So the first approach is one that was proposed by Wesley Smith. He proposed that we establish a populist commission in the early months of the President Trump's administration. The commission that he proposed a few years ago would have been geared towards debate, with the commissioners representing different aspects and points of views in the United States society. So bringing these differing opinions together and essentially allowing the members to debate. So the goal, rather than coming up with proposed guidelines or reaching consensus, would actually be geared towards public engagement with bioethical issues through this debate as a learning process. So this commission would certainly look different, some of the ones in the past in many ways, but arguably would still keep that spirit of public engagement and education very much relevant to it. And I know it's been a few years since he proposed that, but I think that it's an interesting proposal and one that I think many of the reasons he gave in support would still stand today as a potential possibility. Another approach to a potential commission would be a more pluralistic commission that's focused on coming to definite conclusions through compromise and deliberation. So this would probably look a little bit more familiar to some of the previous commissions in some ways. Except for this one, I envision would recognize and be transparent in the recognition that we live in a society that is pluralistic, where we don't all agree, and maybe we're not going to on some things. And so how do we live together in society in a way um, that we can still live peacefully and maybe move forward, maybe actually, come to some sort of conclusions. So that's what this approach to a commission would be focused on. So recognition of the pluralistic society, but still aiming to come to some sort of agreement to move forward. Its challenges would largely be coming to definite conclusions. If we do disagree, there's some things that are hard to reach a compromise position on, that doesn't end up just being an averaging of beliefs. So how we would think about that and engage in a way, an honest engagement, but still come to some productive answers. Another approach could be perhaps a more cohesive council, but maybe less representative of the American public. And this would be a commission that would be just more aligned with whatever administration is in leadership with their agenda and goals. So this would likely operate a bit more efficiently, be aligned, kind of coming into it. But obviously, that would probably be the least representative as a democratic body. Okay, so those are just three potential kind of ways to approach a commission in the future. So be thinking about just your reactions to each of those, if any of them resonate, or maybe sound like good ideas, or maybe not so much. Think about what the benefits of these different types of commissions would be, what the challenges would be, and if you were to have a say in establishing a new bioethics commission for moving forward, starting now, what you think it should look like. So I want to encourage you to think about that a little bit. I have a few concluding thoughts that I just want to share with you all as well, kind of reflecting on my own, sharing my own reflections as I've been thinking about the future of bioethics at a national level, and the role of advisory commissions in that. So to determine what a new bioethics commission should look like, I think it's important to ask and just pause and ask, what is the role of a bioethics commission in democratic society? I've given some examples of things that commissions have done in the past and ways they've engaged, but what does that role look like now? And so these are some answers that have been given to this question, some by some very smart scholars who've thought about this very deeply. Some are ones that I've thought of as I've just been reflecting on this, but thinking about that role. So here's some potential answers. To offer solutions to specific problems. So kind of a real-time, real issue, and a real response, guidance for moving forward. The role, I think, broadly has been accepted to be to advise the president, other elected officials on challenging ethical issues the country is facing. Their role is not to legislate or actually write policy. So I do think that's important to specify there as well. I think part of the role is to educate. And I think that role of educating can include our leaders as a nation, but I also think it means educating and including the public, the people whose lives are affected by these decisions. And with that, I think bioethics advisory commissions can function as a type of a public forum, to be a place where we can debate and discuss and think deeply and present thoughtful questions about these issues that we're facing. So I think we need a new presidential bioethics commission. That's probably become apparent throughout my talk, that I think these are important advisory bodies. I think they play an important function in our society. And I think that, particularly the pandemic that we're in has raised issues that I think would really value from the guidance of an ethical an ethical commission. We've had issues with allocation of scarce resources, whether that be vaccines or ventilator support, particularly more early in the pandemic in the US. Personnel. I think these are all allocation issues or things we could address and offer some guidance with a commission. Questions regarding the vaccine trials and emergency use authorizations. The impact of the pandemic on other healthcare aspects of healthcare, on other surgeries, on procedures being postponed or impacted by this. Even things like just the standard childhood immunizations being impacted by the change in access to medical care over this time. So I think those are things that could definitely be addressed. I think helping navigate through these serious and important issues where we're having to grapple with the tension that exists between saving lives and economic health, social well-being, and public health. These are all things that are important, and we're having to kind of just work our way through those. And I feel like those are issues that could really benefit. That's just one example. Ultimately, I think the commissions that the commissions provide a space for discussion of serious and important ethical issues that are facing our nation. And I think that having a bioethics advisory commission in place signals to the country that the administration is taking these ethical issues and concerns really seriously, and they want to make informed policy decisions on them. I think that can be beneficial in and of itself as well. I mentioned I see these as serving an important role in public education and serving as a public forum. And I think that the public education role can be direct or indirect, whether it's directly through the reports and materials they produce, or just the way what they're recommending becomes incorporated into our practices. This opportunity to learn and engage with these and many other important bioethics issues at a national level is one I hope to see revive soon. I think the advisory commissions are just a really neat, unique, and thoughtful way of approaching bioethics. And so I would like to see them come back. So just to conclude, since the first National Bioethics Commission was established in 1974, the commissions have continued to be part of leading the national conversation on bioethical issues. Their focuses have varied and their roles have shifted with the administrations and leadership, but they've been a source of engagement on these challenging ethical issues, connecting governmental leadership with the public and scholars, raising thoughtful challenges and offering guidance on how we as a nation should address these issues of ethics that impact all of us. So moving forward, I see this as an opportunity. I think we have an opportunity to have a commission that provides creativity and guidance on how we think about these challenging issues that we're facing with and living with today. And I hope to see this tradition of National Bioethics Advisory Commissions continued once again. I think there's a value in doing ethics together and doing it publicly and engaging with these issues that are so important and impactful to us all, and doing it together in community.